Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Good morning. Welcome to the Visiting Speaker Series. I'm glad you could all join us at 0:30 this morning. Our guest today is Steven Johnson, author of Mind Wide Open and Emergence. He's been here to speak about both of those books, so if you decide you're interested in those, you can look up Whack Whack ResNet and watch those talks as well. And his new book is Everything Bad is Good for You, which Kim Ricketts pointed out to me is probably our second favorite title to Eat More, Weigh Less, which is also a very exciting topic. But Steven is a fantastic journalist. He writes for Discover, he writes for the New York Times, he writes for Wired, and just has a lot of fascinating things to say all the time. So whenever I get the chance to drag him out to Microsoft, I will do it in a second. So I'm so glad you could make the time for us this trip. Please help me welcome Steven Johnson.
Thank you, Tamara. This is great. I really have, it's like this ritual when a new book comes out. I get to come here and talk to all of you, and that is always so much fun. So part of what I get out of this is hearing your responses to these ideas. So I will talk for a while and show you some things and kind of walk you through a little of the argument of this book, but hopefully we'll have some discussion too, because that's the fun of it for me. Since I've been on book tour, and I'm getting incredibly sick of talking about the book, so I could just stop now if you guys want to talk about it. For some reason, this book is striking a nerve. Unlike any of the other books I've written, this is a book about which it's on a topic about which people have already formed strong opinions. The other ones, my book Emergence, some of you may have read, and I would describe it to people, and they would say, "You're writing a book about ants, and what? What are you talking about?" With this one, by the time I get to the subtitle, which is How Today's Popular Culture is Actually Making Us Smarter, people are already, I can't even finish saying the subtitle, and people are arguing or talking about their theories about pop culture. And I've done a couple of radio interviews in the last few days, including one with some Seattle radio station the other night, where I couldn't really even get in a word edgewise, where I'm the guest, and the talk show host is like, "I have another theory about The Sopranos," So it's like, you did book me for this, and if you'd like me to talk, I'm willing to do it. So it's fun, and it seems to have struck a little bit of a nerve. My favorite little kind of bit of media coverage that we got is the cover of Time Out New York here. Their sizzling summer reading issue. You'll see what she's reading there. People, they have posters. When Time Out comes out in New York, they put posters of it all over the city. And so there were people coming out of the subway, and there's this model in a bikini reading my book. People often ask me who my imagined reader is. And now I can point to her. So yeah, we had no idea that was coming. We knew it was going to be reviewed, but then we were like, "Whoa, what is that?" So anyway, it's all exciting, but also exhausting. So if I keel over in the middle of this, please wake me. This book is trying to kind of open up a new front in the debate over the state of popular culture that's been going on in this country over the last few years. Everything from is The Sopranos too violent to is Janet Jackson ruining the nation. And is Grand Theft Auto turning us all into a bunch of homicidal carjackers? And I'm trying to kind of intervene and basically say that, in fact, there are a lot of positive developments happening that we don't focus on nearly enough, partially because we don't understand nearly well enough some of these new interactive forms, the games in particular. To give you just an example of the mentality that I'm kind of struggling against here, this is a quote that's up right at the front of the book from George Will. And it's a classic George Will quote in both the content and form. And it reads, "Ours is an age besotted," just the besotted alone, it's George Will, "with graphic entertainments and an increasingly infantilized society whose moral philosophy is reducible to a celebration of choice. Adults are decreasingly distinguishable from children in their absorption of entertainments and the kinds of entertainments they are absorbed in. Video games, computer games, handheld games, movies on their computers, for God's sakes, movies on their computers. This is progress, more sophisticated delivery of stupidity. So what I'm trying to say is, in fact, that by a whole host of important measures, if you look not so much at the content or the moral values being presented by the pop entertainment today, but if you look at the kind of thinking you have to do to make sense of your average video game or television show, or kind of work your way through a piece of software, that the story of the last 30 years is a story of increased complexity, increased mental engagement, increased thinking and cognition, and not this kind of dumbing down scenario. I got to this in a sense from a couple of different things over the years that influenced me, and I may have even told this story a few years ago when I was here, but it's the story that shows up in the book, and it made a big impact on me when it happened. It was about 3 or 4 years ago, and it was right at the end of the debate that came after Columbine about first-person shooter games and Quake and Doom, and there was this general sense that the video games today were all about just running around and shooting things, and that was the only thing that was happening, and it was all, can you press the buttons faster and faster, and can you kill things? And of course, I'm sure there are a lot of gamers in the room. We know that in fact the best-selling game of all time is The Sims. If you look at the bestseller lists, they're dominated by games that are incredibly complex, incredibly challenging, and often not violent. Whether it's Civilization or Age of Empires or all the sports simulations, all the way down to a game like SimCity. All of these are huge successes, and on the top 10 list, there's always 1 or 2 Quake or Doom type titles, but they are the exception, not the rule. Now, a few years ago, I sat down with my then 7-year-old nephew and wanted to show him. We were on vacation somewhere, and I wanted to. It was a rainy day, and I thought, well, I'll show him this latest version of SimCity that has come out, and I was in the middle of playing, and I thought that would be kind of fun. And so I basically set him up with the game on the PowerBook, and basically took him on a kind of, I think what must have been kind of a condescending tour of the city, basically thinking, oh, I'll pretend like I'm just walking around and showing him the graphics, and this is my mayor's house that I built. Isn't that pretty? And look, the zoo. They're animals. You can see the little animals there, Wyatt. Look at the animals. And, I showed him a few other things, and I must have explained a little bit about the logic of the game, but I wasn't really thinking that I was doing that at all. And after about 25 minutes, I said, I'm having a little bit of trouble with this one kind of rundown industrial area, that these factories here have got a lot of crime, and a couple of them are actually abandoned, and I just can't get this going. And he looked at it, and he turned to me, and he said, I think we need to lower our industrial tax rates. I mean, he said it as if he were saying, I think we need to shoot the bad guy. That was the obviousness of the sentiment. And I thought, here's a guy who, if you sat him down in an urban studies classroom and talked to him about the impact of, taxation on urban development, he would either, fall asleep or climb out the window in the space of, 30 seconds. But something about the interactive nature of the game environment was causing him to think, and to think in a very particular kind of way. And that's one of the things I really want to talk about today. Is to look at this complex system on the screen, to look at all the variables, and look at the dynamic of, if you change this, this happens. If you raise this, this happens. If you move this, this happens. And figuring out the kind of the logic of this system on the fly, without looking at a manual, without me even really trying to explain the game to him in much detail. He was already kind of piecing it together and working out a kind of a theory of how the system of the city worked. So to give you a contrast to that, I'd like to go back in time. Some of you may have seen this wonderful video. It was on, Boing Boing and a few other places. But it's worth seeing. I won't subject you to the whole thing because it is incredibly slow and boring, which is the point, by the way. And I'll show you one other thing like that. I've got a lot of incredibly slow and boring things to show you today. This is a film, a very helpful film called How to Use the Dial Telephone. They came out in 1926, I believe. And I want you to notice, the thing about this film that's worth noting is not just that they have to explain how to use the dial telephone, because it was a new thing, okay? But look how much they have to explain the explaining of how to use the dial telephone, right? So this is how to use the dial telephone, and they're going to warn, basically, at every stage of this, every little piece of what seems like incredibly intuitive information, not only do they have to spell it out to you, but they will walk through that information and that kind of technique that you have to master basically 4 or 5 different times from different angles. So just the pacing of the explanation is what's interesting here. So first they're telling you, don't use them until Saturday, May 28th, and you have to use the telephone directory. And now it actually has this great little animated text effect here, which they must have spent a lot of time on in 1926. Basically saying, do not use until a certain date, and then they emphasize it there again. Now we'll get into the meat of how to use the dial telephone. So if you want to take notes on this, this is a good thing to learn. Okay, so, oh wait, hold on. We still have to remind you of May 29th, just in case you missed that before. Now, suppose you want to call Roth Brothers 723G. Okay? So we better obtain the correct number from the directory, right? We're not calling up the operator and asking for it. We've got to obtain the correct number. That's fine. Okay, so there's a little lady. She's obtaining the correct number from the directory. That's helpful. Okay, we got that. Oh, wait. Let's just show another lady, this time a real one, obtaining the number from the directory. Got it. Okay, now, how do we do? Oh, wait, let's do a close-up just to make sure that we understand. That's fine. Okay, we got that. We got the number. Now we're going to dial. Are we ready to dial? Let's start dialing. Okay, we got the number. There it is. Now, how the hell do we dial? Okay, remove the receiver. Now, this is important. Kids, pay attention to this. Do not jiggle the switch hook. That is a very important thing. So we take the, okay, now we listen for the dial tone. I think that's important. What is the dial tone? It's a humming sound. That's understandable. They didn't have dial tones. Okay. So, okay, we listen for the dial tone. Oh, right, it's coming through the ear because you're listening. Sure, that makes sense. And now, what to dial? This is where it gets hot. Yeah, she's picking it up, and now she's ready. She's listening for the dial tone. Now she's going to dial. Okay, so she dials the phone, right? All right, good. Let's look at that phone from another angle. Make sure we got that right. She picked it up. Close up on the dialing. Some text to explain how the dialing works. And there we go. Okay. Well, that's helpful. Now let's show it. And okay, now we release it. You release it. That's great. We could just watch this for the rest of the talk and then ask questions because you get the idea. So there's a major kind of shift here. Now, imagine that kind of mentality of figuring out the dial telephone and switch to my nephew figuring out SimCity in the space of 20 minutes. That's the kind of increase. Now, I call this trend the sleeper curve, after a very famous scene in Woody Allen's movie Sleeper, which I'll show you in 1 second. Where Woody Allen is a health food store operator in 1973 who wakes up 200 years in the future. And the scientists who are watching him are puzzled by the food he keeps asking for. And this is the scene.
Well, he's fully recovered, except for a few minor kinks.
Sound?
Has he asked for anything special?
Do we have the sound for the
Yes,
computer?
this morning for breakfast.
Okay, hold on. Let me go back. Let's watch this again.
Well, he's fully recovered, except for a few minor kinks.
Has he asked for anything special?
Yes, this morning for breakfast. He requested something called wheat germ, organic honey, and tiger's milk.
Oh, yes, those are the charmed substances that some years ago were felt to contain life-preserving properties.
You mean there was no deep fat? No steak or cream pies or hot fudge?
Those were thought to be unhealthy. Precisely the opposite of what we now know to be true.
Incredible.
So this is the sleeper curve. All these things over the last 30 years that were once thought to be unhealthy for our brains, all this pop culture, this junk culture, actually may be behind the scenes improving our minds in these ways. So let's start with games, or continue on with games since we've already done. This is a representative kind of sentiment about games from Dr. Spock's, the late Dr. Spock's manual, baby manual, updated for the new millennium as it advertises itself. And he says, after a long section on the importance of reading, he says that the best that can be said of games is that they may help promote eye-hand coordination in children. The worst that can be said is that they sanction, even promote aggression and violent responses to conflict. But what can be said with much greater certainty is this: most computer games are a colossal waste of time. So that's the kind of attitude out there in the kind of conventional wisdom about games. So let's go back and take a step back and think about why it is we encourage people to read, and then we can talk maybe about the importance of gaming, right? There is the information that you get from a book, and I don't mean to discount that. That is hugely important. You get more information about the world in general right now than you do from playing even the best video game. You may have noticed I write books for a living. I'm a big believer in books. I'm a big believer in the importance of reading. If everybody stopped reading and started playing Grand Theft Auto all day, I'd be out of a job. I love my weblog. I love games, but I would never attempt to convey the argument of this book in anything other than in a book form. It requires 250 pages of kind of linear reasoning, and it's an important part of the culture. So, just to be clear, I'm not against books. And the information kind of content of books is really, the kind of core of it. But there are other reasons why we argue that reading is important that go beyond reading. We think that attention, we think in novelistic reading, and sometimes in argumentative reading, the following of kind of distinct narrative threads, holding them all in your head at the same time, the patience of committing to a long read, and the activation of the imagination. All of those are great things. Good for books. They're fantastic. Gaming is a slightly different thing. The virtues of gaming, contrary to what you might expect, or maybe this room may already know, but most people would expect, patience. People do not talk nearly enough about how hard today's games are. I think a lot of the discussion is basically people who've either never played a game or last played a game when they played Pac-Man. And they have no idea of the kind of rigorous, long-term thinking, the amount of time you spent frustrated in game worlds. Anybody who's played, a game all the way to the end knows that there are long periods of time where you're stuck and you're trying to figure out why it is you can't seem to get that door open and what that character was saying. And are you really supposed to be on this part of the ship? Or maybe you should be back there and you don't know, and you spend 45 minutes kind of wrestling with the question of, are you on the right path? Compared to almost all forms of entertainment up to that point, we don't have that kind of sense of, I really have to work through this problem for the next 45 minutes before I can even advance in the game. If that happened to you on a television screen, you would turn the channel immediately. But games are constantly putting you in situations where you're really trying to wrestle with something and you have to be patient in order to solve the problem. The other crucial thing that isn't, it's obvious once you think about it, but I don't think it's said enough, is that games are fundamentally about making decisions. You're sitting, looking at the screen, you're looking at all the variables, you're thinking about what has happened to you before, you're thinking about what you need to do in the future, you're thinking about what the interface is telling you about the current state of the world at this particular point, and you're thinking about various patterns that you may have detected, and you're basing a decision about what to do next on a synthesis of all that information. And that is what happens second after second after second in every instant of playing any kind of video game. The simplest or the most complex. Now, whatever else you want to say about the importance of reading or the importance of watching a great movie, they are fundamentally not about making decisions, right? It's only in the most kind of metaphoric sense that you kind of decide which way to read a novel. You really are reading a novel and basically submitting yourself to somebody else's decisions and their great intellectual riches that come from that. But you don't decide. And is there a more fundamental kind of form of cognition, of being smart, than looking at the data in front of you, thinking about what your goals are, and based on all that information in changing circumstances, coming up with the right decision? I mean, that's a core unit of what it means to be intelligent, and games exercise it every single moment of the game. Now, there are two kinds of subcategories to this decision-making that I want to look at in a little bit more detail. The first, I call, a couple of other people have called probing. The second I call kind of telescopic thinking, and I want to look at what that really means. Probing is, in a sense, what my nephew was doing. This is a screen from SimCity. Probing is sitting there looking at the world, trying to figure out, in a sense, what the physics of the world are, in a literal sense of, can I jump across this canyon without falling to my death, or in the kind of more metaphoric sense of, if I raise taxes, it stifles development, but if I build a school, people will move in, trying to figure out the underlying logic of the system. One of the crucial things about games is that you learn the rules as you play the game. So in a sense, games are like playing chess, where they sit you down at the chessboard and say, we're not going to tell you the rules of chess, much less the strategy of chess. We're not even going to tell you what the pieces do. And you have to kind of figure out by trial and error with these pieces whether you can move your queen this way or your knight this way. Or your rook this way. And games constantly force you to kind of deduce these things on the fly, and you probe the system. So in SimCity, these are just a few of the little screens, the many, many screens that you can pull up to get information about every little detail. I mean, this is, the data on one building. So you've, queried this one building, and you get all this kind of information. Every single building on the screen, and of course the city is much, much larger than that, has specific information like that. So you can go around and click on it and figure out what's going on. And all of these things lead to other screens about, the status of your world. So that probing and exploring the world and trying to figure out the rules and the physics of the world is a huge kind of thinking. Now, a lot of people have this idea that, they sometimes think that I've kind of stacked the deck a little bit by talking about SimCity because it's such a great game on a lot of fronts. But even if you look at, the sports simulations that dominate the the charts in a lot of ways. People have this idea that the sports simulations are just about hand-eye coordination and picking a curveball or a fastball and swinging and trying to hit the ball. But in fact, they too are really complicated worlds in the sense that you can manage an entire season of a team, which people do, kids do all the time, right? They spend whole long stretches of time managing a team through an entire season and beyond. And when you do that, you literally have a to-do list. It's literally called the to-do list. These are your goals for 3/30/2004. You've got a list of objectives. You've got to make a profit of a certain amount. You've got to limit your spending. You've got to improve the team by increasing the hitting rating and the overall rating. Aaron Seal is overpaid. Isn't that true? Troy Percival has been loyal to us, and he's vital to our team. Find some room in our budget to re-sign him. So you've got kind of the emotional feelings of the baseball players, of financial needs, goals that have been set for you, and you have to juggle all these things in order to kind of play the game all the way through. It even goes as far to, this is kind of the Steinbrenner menu. You have the owner menu, and you have a big chart of the owner's mood, so you can kind of figure out, oh dear, Steinbrenner's mad. He can either be happy or angry, or in the case of Steinbrenner, kind of manic or homicidal. And this kind of juggling of objectives, where you're constantly thinking, okay, my long-term objective is this, my short-term objective is this, is what I call telescopic thinking, in the sense that you have to keep kind of long-term objectives clear in your head, but also focus on the near-term. And they end up kind of in this nested kind of system, almost like a collapsed telescope, where I'll walk through this in a second, you'll see it, where objectives have to kind of be followed in the right sequence for the game to work, not unlike the way we think about programming. So the objectives you'd have to think about in the universe of Pac-Man basically could be expressed. This is a full expression of the world of Pac-Man, basically. You have to complete the current maze. To do this, you have to move the joystick through the maze and avoid the monsters. And you can clear the board of monsters by eating the pellets, and you can also eat the fruit or whatever for little bonus points. That's basically the system of objectives that are in the mind of the Pac-Man player circa 1985 or whenever. Look at a game like a Zelda game for Nintendo, like the Wind Walker, I think this one is. This is the macro list of objectives in playing Zelda all the way to the end. At the top, it's the ultimate goal is to rescue your sister. To do this, you have to defeat the villain. To do this, you need weapons, and then you need the Pearl of Din. The Pearl of Din, you need to cross the ocean. And then you kind of get down to almost like the metabolic level in this world of you have to stay alive, and to do all that, you have to move the controller. And of course, we know just moving the controller, you people built those Xbox controllers, you know how complicated they are. So that's not only just a list of multiple things you have to think about, but it's a list that has to be kind of thought about in sequence. So this is not, very important point here, this is not just, multitasking. The kids today, checking their email and listening to their music and watching TV out of the corner of their eyes. This is actually very organized, structured thinking. You can't just do this in any order. You have to figure out the right order. And in fact, it's, as you know, much more complicated than that. This is just what the full, not even full list of real objectives, kind of local objectives that you have to think about to complete this one stage of the game, which is about maybe an hour or two of play. So to locate the Pearl of Din, you need to help the islanders solve their problem. To do this, you need to cheer up the prince. To do this, you need to do this, to do this, to do this, to do this, to do this. And it actually would go on for a full other page. That's about 2 hours of gameplay. And none of this is spelled out to you, right? There's no, unless you go and buy the game guide or download a walkthrough from the internet. You have to figure out all these objectives and execute them in the right order. Now there may be different ways of doing it, but there's a finite number of ways that will actually work. So you're building this kind of model in your head. This is what is going on in the mind of the Zelda player who might be 8 years old when they're playing the game. Now this also, just like decision making, is the way we think about as grown-ups in real life. When you're sitting there thinking, I have to finish this memo so that I can get this project closed down, so that I can impress my boss, so that I can get a raise, so I can buy that car, so that my girlfriend will, whatever it is, the sequence in your head, that's just the sequence in my head. Your mileage may vary. And so being able to build these models is, mentally challenging and stimulating, and it's exercising a muscle that is really has real-world applicability. Now, the least interesting thing about this is that you're rescuing a princess, right? I mean, the content is not what you care about. But, the the content of chess is not what we care about either. It's a very boring story. It always ends the same way. The plot of a chess match is not what's interesting. It's the kind of thinking that you do when you engage in playing chess that we care about. Some of you may, in fact, think, that ultimately this is still too kind of fairy tale-like. And you look at, you have to use a bomb to blow up the rock and make the bomb plant grow, and you need to get the, it just seems kind of silly. And if you look at this in the way people often do when they look at games as almost like literary critics, they would say, but where is the psychological depth? There's no complexity to this. I don't know anything about, the metaphors are not very rich and everything like that. And they are absolutely right. It's kind of child's play in terms of the content. But I would say that what this is better compared to is not a novel or a poem or something like that. It's more like this kind of thing that you know from school. Simon is conducting a probability experiment. He randomly selects a tag from a set of tags that are numbered 1 to 100. What are the chances you'll match this number on the 100th try? 1 out of 100. It's like a word problem-like situation. Now, if you look at this as a literary critic, you say, who is Simon? We know nothing about him. What an odd thing for him to do. What is Simon's motivation? It doesn't make any sense. But we accept the idea that doing these things are good for our brains because, it's the exercise. So I think it's better to describe these what's happening in a game in this form. You need to cross a gorge and you have to do this. What are your options? Pick one of these options and see if it works out. Briefly, I'll just summarize. There's a wonderful book called What Video Games Can Teach Us About Learning and Literacy by this guy, James Paul Gee, who, if he hasn't come here to talk, should. And he has something that he calls Gee's cycle, which is basically this is how it works when you think in a video game. You have to probe the world, and based on reflection while probing, you form a hypothesis about what something might mean, and then the player reprobes the world with that hypothesis in mind, seeing what effect it generates, and then you treat this effect as feedback from the world and accepts or rethinks his or her original hypothesis. In other words, ladies and gentlemen, it's the scientific method, right? That's the universe of kind of gaming. That's what's going on. Now, I suspect, I would wager that actually that people in this room are probably more sympathetic to the gaming argument than my television argument. And to some extent, I agree with you. I think my television argument is really, really weak. No. I think what is actually happening, and we ran this whole craziness of this book coming out, started with this Times Magazine excerpt of the television section that was provocatively called Watching Television Makes You Smarter. And every parent who's refused to let their kids ever watch television was trying to find out where I lived, that kind of stuff. And let me preface this by saying that what I'm talking about is a trend in the culture, right? It's a 30-year trend, the sleeper curve idea. And so what I'm trying to say about television is that television has grown more complex in all these ways over the last 30 years. I think that actually television is not driving that process. I think that actually the interactive media is driving that process, and the television, in a sense, has had to play catch-up. So that the 15-year-olds that have played Zelda all the way to the end and then expect that kind of mental challenge and engagement from their entertainment, sit them down in front of Three's Company and they'll say, I don't want this. This is not nearly stimulating enough. And so there have been a whole host of shows, which I'll talk about briefly, everything from Alias to Lost to The Sopranos to 6 Feet Under to The Wire, even in a certain sense some of the reality shows that have really grown in complexity in lots of different ways, precisely because I think the brains of this younger generation have been trained to expect more mental challenge. And so I think television is getting smarter, but I think maybe the interactive media is maybe making it smarter. So that caveat. Let me show you two of the variables, and I talk about more in the book, two kind of axes along which television has really grown more complex. The first is multithreading. This is my little. I have charts and graphs in this book, which I've never had before. I'm very proud of these. This is a way of representing. I'm going to license these out, by the way. Anybody who wants to start charting other narrative forms can pay me little royalties. This is basically, the narrative line of Dragnet over time. It's just a line. This is one episode. Basically, any episode of Dragnet is one narrative plot, right? So a crime is committed, then they come in and they try and solve the crime, and then they solve the crime at the end. And you're following this kind of one sequence. And then you start to get these slight complications. This is what an episode of Starsky and Hutch basically looks like, which is there's a little joke plot at the beginning, and then they start investigating the crime, and they solve the crime, and then the joke plot comes back at the end. So it's like, Starsky gets a funny haircut, and then they solve the crime, and then at the end, Hutch gets a funny haircut, and that's, And that's how it works, right? So in 1981, NBC comes out with Hill Street Blues. And but interestingly, there's a whole sub-thing about this, but it borrows this multi-threaded idea, although it makes it much more complicated, from soap operas. And puts it on the air in primetime television with a kind of gritty realism that had never really been seen before. And it was significantly more complicated than anything that had been on TV. It has this, basically, average Hill Street Blues episode has kind of 2 to 3 dominant plots and about 3 or 4 kind of subsidiary plots that are woven in. 1 or 2 is comic, 1 or 2 is just kind of background stuff that's happening over the course of the season. And you can see here, actually, it's kind of fun to map this. This is the famous roll call at the beginning of Hill Street Blues, where they would sit there and say, "Be careful out there," or whatever they would say. And they would introduce each plot there. So this was kind of almost training wheels for what was happening. They were like, okay, we know it's complicated, but we're going to tell you about each plot right at the beginning so that you can, if you need to write this down at home, you can follow it along, right? So Hill Street Blues introduces all this complexity. And here's the interesting thing. It was just too complicated for the audiences of 1981. When they aired the pilot, when they screened the pilot, everybody was like, I can't keep it all straight in my head. There are too many characters, Everybody complained about it. It got unbelievable critical reviews, right? Everybody loved it. It got the greatest press you could ever imagine, and it finished 71 out of 73 in the Nielsen's its first season. It slowly clawed its way, even though it was the most acclaimed show on TV, up to maybe like 30, 35 in the Nielsen's at its high point. And in 1985, they literally, fired Stephen Bochco and hired a new team and released a press release saying, we're sorry, it was too complicated. We're going to make it simpler. We're going to cut some of the plots. We admit it. We pushed you guys too far, and it's going to be simpler, so please come back and watch Hill Street again. So there was this experiment of, in 1982, could the popular imagination kind of hold these many narrative threads in their head at the same time? And the answer was not really. Not really. It was pretty hard. This is what The Sopranos looks like. Now, by the way, just so you know, this is an apples-to-apples comparison. They basically drew about the same number of people because The Sopranos is a huge, network-scale hit that regularly outdraws network shows when it airs. And, Hill Street was a, non-hit in the days of kind of network. So they would draw about, 10 to 12 million people. So it's not a boutique show versus a big mainstream show. It's the same size audience. The Sopranos has no sense of kind of really dominant plots. Almost every plot is kind of equally weighted. There generally are more of them. They have this chordal kind of mode of storytelling where a single scene will often reference 3 different plots at the same time, so they're kind of woven together in these kind of intricate ways. And now here's the other thing that's really crucial. These are the plots in Hill Street that point to things outside of the current episode. So everything else is entirely self-contained. You start watching and all the information you need is contained in the 43 minutes of non-commercial narrative time that you have. Nothing else, except for these 2 plots, points to things that have happened in previous episodes, so you don't have to remember anything or keep track of something from previous episodes. These are the plots that point outside the current episode in The Sopranos. Basically, all but one. So the whole universe is constantly, you know what this is like when you watch these shows, and you would see the same chart for any of the shows that I mentioned. They're constantly saying, making a reference to something that happened, 6 episodes ago. And you're like, what was that? I don't even remember. Who is that guy? I don't even know who that guy is. So this was something that was totally forbidden, 30 years ago on TV that regularly happens in, massively hit shows now. So something has changed in our brains and our ability to kind of process this kind of thinking. And this is the kind of thinking that we value when we read novels. This is, again, not multitasking. This is not, discontinuous streams of unrelated information coming in that you're continuously partially attentive to use Linda Stone's phrase. This is taking a narrative, a shared narrative universe and the intersecting lines of cause and effect of all these people's lives and making a kind of consistent model of it. That's an important kind of thinking, right? Now, I want to talk briefly about the best way to get a sense of this is just to remind yourself of how bad the TV used to be and how slow and how simple it was. And I'll show you just a few minutes of this, and I'll say a couple more things. I don't want to cut into our conversation time. So this is a brief exchange from the beginning year of Dallas in 1978. Now, Dallas was, the sound. Yeah, there you go. This is the hottest show on television, the most salacious show on television, a huge hit, and everybody was scandalized at how racy it was, right? So just check this out.
Bobby, help your daddy.
I got it, Miss Ellie. Just don't baby me here. I don't see no card.
Forget the card, Pammy?
It's not from us. It's from JR and me.
Oh, well, I didn't recognize it wrapped there. What'd you do with the card?
It's in the box.
The amount of time they spend unwrapping presents in this scene is unbelievable.
What the hell is it?
It's an antique by an Italian sculptor. I thought it'd look nice in the den.
Yes, it will. It's lovely, Sue Ellen. Thank you.
Mama, this one is from Pamela and myself.
Oh, how nice.
Let's unwrap this present. Oh, does anybody have any scissors? Reaction shots. Oh, good. Everybody's enjoying that.
Oh, Bob. It's beautiful. Look, Jock. All the children when they were growing up. Oh, look at little Lucy. Wasn't she cute?
I think I look dumb.
Oh, Lucy, you were beautiful.
Grandma, you'd say that about any baby.
There hasn't been any babies in this house for a long time.
There, the plot
JR
started.
and I are about to start any day now.
That's the first indication of something at all related to the plot of that episode. Which turns out to be this thing called Black Market Baby, and it's a competition between the brothers to have a baby. And they take that whole long stretch, and it goes on. Really, I could bore you to tears by showing you the second half of it, because it's basically all they're trying to establish is that there's competition between the brothers to have a baby, but they have this 7-minute scene where they could have done it in kind of 30 seconds. So, that was the hottest, most salacious thing on television. That's what it felt like. We forget how slow. Just imagine the kind of, anticipated IQ of the person who's watching that show, and compare it to, shows today. And one way to represent this is social network mapping, which, many of you folks have seen. This is the social network of that episode of Dallas, right? These are the major characters. The darker lines are relationships that are crucial to the plot. And the lighter lines are relationships that are kind of background information that you need just to understand. You need to understand that Bobby and JR are brothers, but that's not, kind of a central thing. And it's basically a network of kind of the family, like 6 or so folks with a couple of other regulars, and then 3 or 4 folks who are thrown in who are specific to the episode. And these are the only people who show up in this episode of Dallas. And you have to kind of, and this was the most complicated kind of social network structure, basically, at least tied for it, on the air in 1978. This is what an episode of 24 looks like. One episode. So there are like 31 characters, and it's actually even more complicated than that because there's a mole plot in 24. This is season 1, episode 8. The exact same point in the evolution of the series is the Dallas. There's a mole plot, so even relationships that aren't explicitly spelled out, you're thinking about because you're trying to figure out who the mole is in the unit where Jack Bauer works, and so you're actually thinking about these 4 or 5 other relationships that aren't specifically there. So your brain is actually even working kind of harder. Now, this, by the way, it's not the same in terms of the content, but this is what the kind of map you would get if you mapped, Middlemarch, right? It's kind of 4 competing families and about 30 characters woven together in all these different kind of complicated ways. It's really the social scale of the 19th century novel. So, not in content, but in form. Television has moved much more kind of novelistic in the kinds of things that it's representing. Very quickly, why is this happening? Because it does fly in the face of so much of our conventional ideas about the people who are really always seeking out the lowest common denominator, and mass culture is always trying to dumb down and give us the cheapest and most instant gratification. So I think there are a couple of forces that are at work, and the second half of the book is really wrestling with this question of why the sleeper curve is happening. The first is the tremendous explosion of, particularly where television is concerned, of technologies of repetition, technologies that let you pause, rewind, repeat, view in all these different ways. I mean, basically the story of the last 20 years is a story of all these new technologies that let you do that in one form or another, starting with the VCR. I mean, we forget that television was, for all intents and purposes, in 1977, a purely live medium in terms of your apprehension of it as a consumer. It was either taped or live, depending on how it was being broadcast. But when you were sitting down to watch Charlie's Angels and you missed something, there was no way to stop it. You had to wait until the summer repeats came on before you could see it again. There was no option for kind of seeing it again or rewinding or watching the episode over again. Ever since then, we've had VCR, we've had the importance of syndication as the cable universe has exploded, so that Seinfeld and The Simpsons, their creators made their vast fortunes from syndication deals, where people are watching the same episode 6 or 7 times, in the same week. Obviously, DVD, TiVo, on demand, and now BitTorrent, downloading whole episodes or seasons of shows. And what that creates, as all but the final category there, BitTorrent, what that creates is an environment where there are suddenly economic rewards, in fact, vast economic rewards, for content that can be viewed multiple times. So you want to actually create something that somebody will enjoy on the 4th viewing and not something where they just get tired of it after the first time they've seen it. So suddenly it becomes possible, and in fact it becomes valuable to create something like Seinfeld where you can sit there and watch it 3 times and be like, oh my god, I never got that reference to that episode from season 1 that Elaine has, or The Simpsons, which has about 14 different film references in every episode, or The Sopranos, or 24, where the shows are just really, really complicated, and you want to watch them on DVD because you might want to watch them twice because they're so intricate. So the balance has gone from being don't throw anybody off because they're watching it live, and if we confuse them in any way, we're going to lose audience, to what I call in the book kind of most repeatable programming. The most repeatable programming is the most valuable programming. For some reason, this slide has lost its title. There's another factor here, which I call the H factor. I think this was I don't know, it's something about the importance of the internet. Years ago, I started describing, in my first book, I started describing these early websites that were basically forms of media that were commenting on other media, and I called them parasites, in a sense that they were sites that existed off of these larger host organisms. And this is basically what the blogs often do today, where they're either commentary on their favorite television show or a walkthrough gut advice kind of FAQ-like thing for their favorite video game, or they're commenting on what the New York Times is saying. They're kind of people, ordinary people, armchair people in their pajamas, as the saying goes, writing about other forms of media. If you look at the universe of kind of fan sites that are out there, there is an insane amount of stuff. Go to the fan sites for 24. You will find every single episode is dissected and analyzed and scrutinized with an incredible, almost academic intensity. So every little detail and every little reference is noted. For The Simpsons, there is this authoritative guide to every single film reference in every single episode of The Simpsons, documented by just these obsessed people who have way too much time on their hands for some reason. And what that means is that the complexity can actually increase because there's in a sense a kind of a safety net that the internet is offering. So if the shows get really complicated, they know they can always go online and find out more information or figure out what that character was doing or who was related to who in that scene. Game walkthroughs are the greatest example of this. The games are able to get so complicated because fans know they can go and download some fan-authored walkthrough for a game and figure out how to get to the next level, because otherwise certainly somebody like me who doesn't have a lot of time would never be able to make it through level 1 of most of these games, because I'm not as smart as the kids are today. The game walkthrough created by some crazy guy in Australia for Grand Theft Auto that kind of describes the entire world of Grand Theft Auto is 53,000 words long. So it's about 6,000 words longer than the book I'm here to talk about. So that's a big world. It takes a lot of words to describe that world. That's a sign that the culture is pretty complex and that that stuff is out there, and so it sustains more complicated programming. And then the final thing I'll say is that I think the other force here is really the human brain. I think that there's a myth about the kind of the slacker mind that we all just want to zone out in front of the cheapest pleasure that we can find. I think, in fact, that we are very much like a problem-solving species. And the problem is that we haven't had media that was able to kind of respond to that or challenge us in that way for quite a long time, since kind of the early days of television. And what we're getting now with interactive forms is obviously this ability to go in there and kind of test your abilities respond to your kind of growing skill levels and train you to get better at things and keep you at this kind of really promising zone where it's kind of hard but not too hard, and the game will kind of scale along with your abilities. And in a sense, television shows have been doing that on a macro scale. They've been getting harder and harder slowly over time so that each show is a little bit more challenging, and you're right at that zone where you're trying to figure it out, and it's stimulating, but it's not so hard that you're totally confused. That is a very fertile zone. Cognitive scientists sometimes call that the regime of competence. It's that zone right there at the edge of your abilities where you're teased along to be sharper. Games live exactly in that zone because they have the feedback from how well the player is actually playing the game. The rest of the media seems to be kind of gravitating towards that zone. And when you create media in that zone, people will respond and they will like to be challenged. They will really enjoy it. So I hope we're moving towards, if this book does anything, we're moving to kind of a new, in a sense, set of criteria for how we evaluate it. So it's not just how many nipples were exposed during the halftime show. But rather, in addition to maybe some of those categories, if they're important to people, that we have other categories, which are ways of thinking, how much engagement in problem solving, how much structural complexity, what kind of thinking do you have to do to engage with that? And frankly, as a parent of young kids who, even though I write about this stuff for a living, I can't keep track of everything that's out there. I would like to see ratings for that as much as I would like to see ratings for bloodshed or obscenity. I would like to know, this is really something that challenges the mind in a lot of ways. It's not educational. In the strict sense of it's not teaching him about 13th century Rome, but it is educational in the sense that it's challenging his or her kind of mental faculties, making him think, making him make smart decisions. And that to me is as valuable as any of the things that we're rating today. So that's my story. I hope you enjoyed it. It's fun always to talk to you. So let's open it up a little bit to some conversations, and then I can sign and talk more face to face. Questions? Yeah.
You didn't mention at all during the talk, like the increasing verbal density of shows. I've seen studies where The Simpsons is supposedly 3 times as verbally dense as The Flintstones.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great point. The West Wing is a great example of that. They sometimes call them like the fast-talking shows. In the West Wing, everybody is talking about 3 times as fast as they would have talked on, a comparable show, and they're also walking all the time. Everything's like they're talking really fast, they're walking through the corridor really fast. And if you only got as much exercise as a watcher of those shows as the actors must get, you'd be good. Yeah. So your ability to just take in, that's, I think, something you can see in that Dallas excerpt is just how slow it is. And again, it's not the increase in speed is not the increase in speed of the MTV cuts per second kind of visual overload that it's often mistaken for. Right? It's not that you're just, wow, there's lots of things happening visually on the screen. It's like I'm following more bits of actual information per scene in today's shows than I was 20 years ago, because for some complicated set of reasons, my brain as an audience member is able to kind of take in that. So that's a great point. Yeah, over there.
How would you sleeper curve rate radio, music, advertising, that kind of stuff?
I don't talk about music in a sense because of the thing that, for 2 reasons in the book. I don't talk about music for 2 reasons. The first is I think that music, obviously can be great for the mind in all sorts of ways, but it's not a problem-solving form, I think. The sleeper curve is really about cognitive engagement and puzzle pattern recognition and things like that. There's a little bit of pattern recognition, I suppose, in music listening, but it's not quite the same thing. You're not reasoning out a situation the way you are in these things that I'm looking at. So I think music kind of activates the mind in a different way. Interestingly, I think you can see this idea of most repeatable programming leading to more complexity, though, and there's a footnote about this in the book, in what happened to pop music in the 60s. As once the economics of the business shifted from throwaway singles to entire albums. So it went from being like, here's a single, we want you to play it 20 times and then throw it away and move on to the next single, to we want you to listen to Dark Side of the Moon 6,000 times. That was one of the things that I think drove the increased complexity of popular music in the 60s, that suddenly people were like, oh, we're creating things that people will really listen to many, many times, rather than something they'll just hear on the radio and kind of drive by it. I don't know about radio. I'll say about one thing about film, though, because people often ask about that. I think that film has not had quite the same trajectory for two reasons. One, film sleeper curve was kind of 1930 to 1950. And then it went from being like, look, we can put people on the screen and they can dance, and oh, they can talk, to like, hey, we could make Citizen Kane, So there was this kind of earlier progression that it had. And the other part of it is there's a crucial dimension here, which gets again to this point about how patience is something we're learning in this pop culture against all the things you've heard, is that these long format dramas and these video games are stories that really unfold over 40 hours or 100 hours or something like that. In fact, I have an article coming out in the Boston Globe on Sunday about what I call kind of extreme time shifting, where instead of doing the time shifting of watching a show on Tuesday instead of Thursday, you basically say, I'm going to watch one show for the next month and a half, and I'm going to watch every episode of The West Wing all the way through. I'm going to watch every episode of 24. And so your schedule, instead of being like ER on Thursday and Seinfeld on Tuesday, it becomes, all right, Alias from April to June. And then we'll pick up Lost, and we'll watch Lost through the summer, and then we'll pick up this other one. And what happens, it's a beautiful way to watch these shows, the shows that have kind of grown in complexity, because the unit of storytelling goes from being 43 minutes interrupted by commercials to at least the length of a season, and sometimes the length of an entire series. And so it suddenly becomes this 100-hour storytelling form. And you can do a lot more with 100 hours of room than you can with 43 minutes of room. And film, sadly, is kind of locked in this 2.5 hours of time. So it's no surprise, in fact, that one of the great, super complex and wonderful successes of the pop culture in terms of box office and engagement is the Lord of the Rings trilogy, because, they had 10 hours to tell it, or actually on the DVD, like about 50 hours. The director's cut is like longer than most television series. So there's a time limit, I think, that is reined in film's ability to kind of do that in the same way. Okay, a couple more. Yeah, in the back.
Yeah, your title of your book, if I can make it out, is How Today's Popular Culture is Actually Making Us Smarter. And I'm wondering if you could define smarter for us, and also talk about if you have any data or anecdotal evidence for the making smarter
part. Yeah, sure. The first thing I'll say is to make a kind of a counter-argument against the argument of the book. If this book were... The true subtitle of this book should be, the many neglected ways in which today's popular culture is making us smarter, with the caveat that there are some ways in which maybe we're not getting quite as smart, though on the whole I think it's positive. And I pitched my editor on that one, but they wouldn't go for it for some reason, So it's it's a more complicated story on some level, and the book makes that clear. I do think, for instance, as I mentioned before, that one of the things we're shifting away from in the culture is sitting down with a book for 300 pages and following a narrative line through 300 pages of storytelling, or following a polemical, argumentative line like my book for 250 pages. That is a crucial unit in the history of thinking and reason, and it is less dominant. It's not going away. It's still there. This book is getting a lot of attention. A lot of people are buying it, so it's still part of the society, but it's less. It is, the novel does not dominate our times the way it did the 19th century, and there is some loss in that, no question about it. But even in that realm, I would say we gain a lot just in the question of dealing with text and words, because, of course, the internet has been this tremendous kind of revitalization of a new kind of literacy, and we actually are reading much more than we were in terms of words on the screen, and we're writing more. That's a key thing that we often forget about. So whatever, yes, it is true, kids today are reading fewer novels, but they sure are posting a lot more kind of elaborate personal stories online and publishing those stories with their friends and with strangers, and creating this whole new form of kind of public discourse that didn't exist at all. And would I rather, in the end of the day, have kids who read other people's novels or write their own stories and engage with other people, actually creating the words themselves? Yeah, I probably would. I'd like to have both. But if I had to choose, I think I might choose the latter. So there are some trade-offs, no question about it. The smarter that I'm really looking at in the book is the smarter of problem solving, sometimes called fluid intelligence, right? And as opposed to crystallized intelligence of kind of knowledge about the world that you've learned, but rather your ability on the spot to just solve things and reason your way through something, a pattern recognition, all that stuff. And in fact, one of the things that I talk about in the book, and that's gotten picked up quite a bit, Malcolm Gladwell reviewed the book this week in the New Yorker, and he led with this, is the Flint Effect, the long-term trend in all modern media societies for IQ scores to go up. They seem to be accelerating in the U.S. over the last 15 years, and they're particularly acute at the subset of IQ of G. You know, the real measure of it's a
G refers to overall intelligence, not the subset of intelligence.
Okay. Yeah,
I'm a psychologist.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So when you look at, I think of all right. That's interesting. I would have described it the other way, but I defer to you. So when you look at G, actually, the increase is even more dramatic. And when you look at the Ravens tests that kind of get us closest to measuring G, they look like video games. Right? I mean, I reproduce, some of you know all this, but some of you may not. And I think people who've taken IQ tests or take the Ravens test and who've played games will say that the feeling in your head is very similar. That when you're sitting there kind of playing Tetris or reasoning your way through a kind of a video game, trying to figure out the kind of system, and then when you sit down with the Ravens and trying to figure out the system and the patterns, that there's something, it feels like the same kind of cognitive muscles are being exercised. So that's the real kind of intelligence that I think is going on in terms of the sleeper curve rise. It's not the only story. But, nobody out there is saying right now, obviously the pop culture is making everybody smarter at, fluid intelligence and abstract reasoning and pattern recognition. It's just that there's all this violence. People are just saying everything's dumber than it was 20 or 30 years ago. Okay, maybe one or two more, maybe back there. Yeah, you.
I had a couple of questions. I haven't read your book yet, so I apologize if it's covered. But on this idea of getting smarter through kind of interactive entertainment, I haven't seen any data, but I would assume that people, like children, for example, are spending more time interacting with machines rather than people than they ever have before. And even if they're kind of playing Xbox Live, it's still via kind of a machine.
Yep.
So what is the social implication for less time being spent with other human beings? That's like my first question. Second question is, in the workplace, we're also seeing this rise, and we've seen it in terms of productivity, but in terms of the amount of information we have to process every day, emails, and people are now blogging and getting RSS feeds, being CC'd on a million things like here at Microsoft.
Yeah.
I mean, is there a point where it just becomes too taxing for the brain to be kind of, this whole problem of information overload? Is there like a limit to how much information we want to process or is desirable, and is it kind of like a diminishing returns game after a certain amount of time?
Yeah, they're both great questions. You could do a whole book on that. Take the first one first. I wrote a piece. It'd be worth tracking down if you're interested in this for Discover, kind of between the last book, Mind Wide Open, which was really just about the brain, and then this book, which was really looking at the work of Antonio Damasio, the brain scientist, and he was working on this idea which he had kind of half developed, and then I encouraged him to talk about it more, and we kind of built it into this longer piece, which is to say basically that there are two different kind of time scales in the brain, and that the kind of the newer, kind of neocortex part of the brain is really, really fast, and the stuff that's doing information processing and things like that really works at just amazing speed and seems to be able to be trained to do things at ever accelerating rates. We haven't hit the kind of limit in terms of just processing information. But of course, for those of you who know Damasio's work, his whole point is that a huge part of intelligence is emotional intelligence in the older parts of the brain that deal with the way that we kind of make emotional kind of gut decisions. Malcolm Gladwell wrote about this in Blink to some extent. And his point is that the emotional circuitry of the brain is, by an order of magnitude maybe, or even more, slower. And that things take time, because emotions are full body experiences. The information of the feeling of an emotion, the feedback you get from an emotional response to something, is something that circulates through the whole body. It doesn't just happen here. So the architecture basically is divided between a very fast kind of information processing and a much slower emotional processing. And so it may well be that we don't hit that kind of cognitive limit yet. We haven't hit it yet in terms of information processing, but our emotional reasoning and the kind of learning we get from emotional feedback may be running into some kind of threshold, and that's something we'd have to think about and be aware of. I think it's a really interesting issue, and it's just the kind of the beginning of understanding what it means. I would say, because I'm upbeat guy for this book tour, that it's worth pointing out though that almost all of the really interesting developments on the internet of the last 3 or 4 years have been about augmenting social connection and augmenting real-world connection in addition to just kind of virtual connection. So all the things that we're all really interested in whether it's online dating, whether it's a social network, Friendster-like things, whether it's Meetup.com. Think about how interesting Meetup.com was in terms of the election in so many different ways, are all about, and the smart mobs kind of idea of, kids using their cell phones to kind of spontaneously join together and meet in places in the city. All these developments are moving away from the kid alone in his computer, not hanging out with anyone. Which, by the way, is what happens when you read books. I mean, it's worth pointing out. If we all want to go back and read books, we're just going to be sitting there, lost in this little world, not talking to our friends. So I'll take this technology. If you're looking for social connection, it's much better, this technology, than the books are. There's no question about that. So I see a lot of interesting developments happening, and the question is where we're going to be in 10 years. If it seems to me that the trend is pointing in the direction of augmenting your social world, and we won't just get kind of compromised emotional IQs from this stuff. But it's still an open question, and it's something we absolutely have to watch very closely. All right, one more question, right? Don't you think? 75 minutes. Okay. Let me go to you. Sorry. Denied. Sorry.
How would you rate something like local news? It seems to me there the audience is demanding. Doesn't have patience, right? No story can be longer than 90 seconds. The audience doesn't want complexity. They don't want to hear about interesting local stories. They want to hear about the latest crimes.
This is good. I see what's happening here. None of my talks thus far have been this. This is get him to admit that something really is crap. Now, you guys are smart. There was a great Saturday Night Live parody of local news that ran a couple years ago where the announcers were like, coming up in just a few minutes, an everyday household substance that may be right in front of you right now could kill you this very minute. We'll be back in 5. And it does have that kind of thing. You know what I think has happened? McLuhan, in a sense, had this idea, which is that, not just that the medium affects the way we perceive the world in all these kind of subtle ways, but also each new medium that comes along has lateral effects on other media around it. So kind of television comes along and radio stops telling stories. Radio was a great storytelling medium, and then when the television showed up and they were like, all right, we're not going to do that anymore. We're going to do traffic. And then, talk radio and so on. And one of the books that I talk about a lot in Everything Bad is Good for You is a real classic in a lot of ways, though you would think I would disagree completely with it, which is Neil Postman's book, Amusing Ourselves to Death, from the mid-'80s, where he really talks about television and entertainment culture kind of taking over everything and the decline of reading and all this kind of stuff. And what I found actually going back and reading the book is that I agreed with everything Postman was saying about what it was like in 1984 or 1978, that kind of period when he was describing it, but that he wasn't writing about the changes that I was documenting. And one of the things that he says about television that he really hates is that television is, unlike other forms, is kind of the go-to medium for everything. So people go there to get entertained, but they also go there to make their political decisions, and they go there to find out information about what movies to watch, and they go there for all these different things. And he was like, television is great at entertaining, but it's really bad at information, basically. And what's happened since then is it is no longer that. He called it our culture's primary way of knowing about itself, or something like that. And the internet is really now that, I think, or is very close to becoming that for a lot of us. Google and also MSN search. Are crucial ways of that's where we go to find information. The blogs are where we go to find, nuanced political kind of discussions, sometimes heated, but nuanced political discussion about politics. And so as that happens, kind of the pressure is off television to be an authoritative news source. You get great, the blogs are going to be huge for real local information, for real fine-grained local information, what's happening in your neighborhood and the people kind of around you. And it's going to reveal that television was always really pretty bad at that. And so as it gets revealed, television just gets more sensationalist and kind of lame at that. But fortunately, it's being supplemented by things that are happening on the net. Amazon searching. One of the jokes that a friend of mine said to me, I think he was joking. He's a literary novelist, and he said to me, the reason I hate you is that the only reason people buy literary novels is because they feel so guilty about all the episodes of The Apprentice that they're watching. And now that you've written this book, nobody's going to ever buy another literary novel. And I was on the Today Show, and I told that joke, and I got to the point of, everybody's watching all these episodes of The Apprentice, and I thought, I can't say that, it's NBC, So I actually edited myself, and then I'm like, I'm such a sellout to the man. I can't believe I could have told truth to power, anyway. All right. I folded here as well. I mentioned MSN Search. Thank you. Thank you very much, Larry.